Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you from my nutshell of infinite space right here in the Wood of the Holly, under the sign, located in the not so enchanted land of law. And today, across this digital divide, I have a really special guest, somebody I'm super stoked to have in the same little digital room here. His name is, I want to say it correctly, William deBuys. Correct. He is really one of the most important conservationists, writers, and philosophical thinkers of our time. He has written extensively about some of the most important and vanishing wild spaces on this earth with a certain kind of reverence and melancholy and accuracy that has moved me to no end. And we're going to talk about that, especially in view of our current moment in politics. And he's with me on the other side. I want to welcome William deBuys to A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you and me from his farm in New Mexico tell me exactly.
Southern Taos County, on the high road between Santa Fe and Taos.
On the edge of the Pecos River in El Valle, New Mexico. He's with me, William deBuys. Correct me.
I'm on the edge, the Rio de las Trampas, the Trampas River runs through the place. The Pecos is one divide over across the high peaks. But I'm just downsloped from the Pecos Wilderness.
Wow, so that's a pretty enchanting backyard, it sounds to me.
It's enchanting, and it's very big.
It's very big. And you also have a farm there. Talk to me just firstly about this farm.
Well, if I look out the window here, I see my hay field, which is now pretty much dormant as winter comes on. And then past the hay field is a grove of cottonwoods, and then the river, and then a pasture on the other side. A year and 2 months ago, we had a forest fire over there on the other side, and that pasture down by the river is a big chunk of it is buried in a debris flow that came out of the burned area. So I've written about climate change. I always sort of mentally held it at a distance, but it's come to visit me and take up residence, in a sense, on my property. So I have a more intimate feeling for it than I used to have.
Well, you wrote about fire in the last book that I read of yours, Enchantment and Exploitations: The Life and Hard Times of a New Mexican Mountain Range. And of course, if you're sitting downwind of a fire, it's a very scary place, but it is part of the natural cycles of life in the mountains. So I don't know if they come as a mixed blessing today as they did in cooler times.
Well, the fires now are different. And this particular fire, for instance, is a good example of the kind of thing that will happen more and more with climate change. That summer, 2 summers ago, we didn't have a monsoon here. And usually we get half of our annual rain in this part of the world from summer rains. After June the 10th, the rain stopped. We never got the thunderstorms we expect in July and August. And at the same time, the median temperature of this whole Southwest was 6 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than the long-term average, which is to say that the conditions that gave rise to the fire that we experienced here were really unusual conditions.
Wow. Well, I was on the Colorado River in September and October, and it felt like we got doused. Like we did get some.
Oh, yeah.
As a matter of fact, when I was on the river, there was some fatalities that we didn't personally observe where we were, but some of the flash flooding up on on the below Marble Canyon. I'm not exactly sure where. We came out and heard about it. We're in a pretty scary and difficult political moment. I went to work and knocked on doors at the border near Yuma, Arizona, actually one of the locations that you wrote about in the first book of yours that I read, salt streams right down below Yuma on the
Right.
border in the center of the Imperial Valley, largely a Hispanic area. And I frankly was taken by surprise. I mean, maybe I live in my own little liberal bubble, but I found it hard to process. It sort of shattered my confidence in my own judgment about my own country.
Yeah,
And
me too. Same thing. The only way I don't know if you ever read in Freud, but my take on it is that the national id uh, rose up and just told the national super ego to get lost, and the danger is that it will.
expand on that so I understand it better.
Well, the id is the part of us that fights any kind of impulse control. It's
Hmm.
just the want part. And the superego is where all those higher values of compassion and kindness and restraint and duty, responsibility, etc., come in. And I just think that this election was a rejection of all those oughts, all those obligations uh, that we hang on ourselves as we try to make a civilization. So there will be no secretary nominated for the Federal Department of Impulse Control.
No.
We're going to have the sort of national political emotions of a 14-year-old boy.
Yeah, the thing, my core observation, and we're both probably old enough to remember Nixon. Nixon had one face for the public and another face card down, for his cronies. So like when those tapes were revealed, I was like, oh my God, he is a crook. But this guy, I call him the PVP, Putin's vice president. He's his corruption is completely transparent. You don't need as a PhD in psychology to see what was patently obvious. I wouldn't pick him for my baseball team in junior high, and it was just I didn't understand it because it's like he hasn't gotten more popular. He hasn't reached out to people that have disagreed with him. He hasn't modified any of his most strident beliefs, and yet if these results are real, I have no reason to believe they're not. It's almost like, well, I don't get it. That's all.
Yeah, I don't really get it either. But here's a convicted felon, a patent liar, a pussy grabber, a guy who shows no respect for anyone, whose only pleasure in humor is when he abases somebody. Um, his fun is always at someone else's cost, and somehow 70 some million people voted for him. I
Yeah,
don't get it. I don't recognize my country. This
yeah.
is not the country I think I grew up in.
And he is the orchestrator and instigator of arguably the biggest political crime in American history. When you go
Absolutely.
back to
Yeah,
2020,
yeah.
um, I remember 2 years ago, I had a number of historians and scholars on, and I was screaming, Section 3, the 14th Amendment, it's there for a reason, and yet it it was ignored. I don't know what that spells for, some of the struggles that you've been at the leading edge of in terms of conservation and trying to rewild some of these places on our earth. Um,
Well, I recently gave a talk to a nonprofit here in New Mexico at their annual meeting about these matters. And one of the things I started out with was that this administration is not going to change the macro trends of advancing climate change. Things are getting worse. The world is not getting a grip on this rising tide of CO2 in the atmosphere and the oceans. And also, it's not getting a grip on the advancing war on wildlife. We're losing natural areas, we're losing the species, we're losing populations of wild animals and so forth at an alarming rate. And, Trump is a little blip in those two trends, but not a determinative one. So the real work remains the same as it has always been. And for me, that comes down to building arks, in a sort of metaphorical way to continue the work of Noah, to build arks in the form of parks and refuges, wilderness areas, you name it, but also in the sense of communities that aren't fractured, in the sense of vessels to hold what's really good in our culture and our civilization, as well as in our natural world. We've got to build these arks, and we know that the seas of the future are going to be very stormy. Not all of our arks are going to get through, but the more we build, the more we'll have a chance to get through. And so that's got to be our work for the present.
When I was reading about the area that you lived in, there was some interesting sort of descriptions about some of the tensions that are part of our larger American life, and that is between individualism and communalism, or I think ejido is la palabra, correct?
Yeah.
And I think you've seen some of those at play right under your nose in New Mexico.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the worst injustices done to the Hispanic people of New Mexico involved manipulation of land grants by people who were both Anglo and, to some degree, upper class Hispanos, who exploited the gaps between English common law that the Anglo invaders brought in and the Mexican and Spanish colonial law that had been in place for the previous centuries.
Right, the lawyers and the land grants scrambling to rip people off. Some of those themes we've seen resonate in movies like Chinatown, whether it was manipulation of, water and rights. And I guess, I don't know if this is an Anglo white person problem or a human issue. I've often grappled with that. Very often people say, well, the native people were, in perfect harmony with their own environment, and we're the destroyers. And I get that, and I see that, but I also think, well, they're also people. Maybe these are human problems as well as racial distinctions. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you can count a lot of angels on the head of that pin as to whether it's Anglos, Northern Europeans, colonialists, or just people globally beating up on each other and taking each other's possessions, including land. It seems to me more the latter. If you think about the movements of people across Asia and Africa and the native world of South America, the Incan Empire was only newly established when Pizarro got there and began to take it apart. But the Incas had extended their hegemony over countless other tribes. So anyhow, human beings are kind of a messy bunch to deal with. I think we agree on that.
Yeah. So you mentioned you're from Maryland, Baltimore. Yeah. You're a tidewater person, fishing and hunting in those brackish slimes that have so many fish and crabs. And you found your way, I'm just kind of skipping a stone over your biography, across the south of, North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And you land in New Mexico and found a home there, obviously. And did you feel any resentment as one of those perhaps Anglo land grant manipulator dudes.
There are a lot of tensions here in New Mexico along those ethnic lines. But I was fortunate, very fortunate. I mean, I count my lucky stars every day. I fetched up in a village in northern New Mexico, uh, living next door to a really remarkable old man, Jacobo Romero, one of the great teachers of my life, who accepted me and the other couple of Anglos I was with almost right away, provided that we were useful. And we were useful. We helped him with chores, uh, any number of things, helped him fix things, helped him move his cattle, helped him clean the irrigation ditch, stuff like that. We worked shoulder to shoulder, and he became like a grandfather to us, and other members of this community became very, very close friends. And so, uh, we recognized that we were late arrivals in the invasion of 1846. The Anglo invasion of New Mexico continues to this day. But we tried to live here respectfully. We tried to live here making friends. And I think we pretty much succeeded in that and built a home.
And this is a gentleman you wrote a book about also.
That's right. That's right. A book called River of Traps, which is a biography of, if you will, and a memoir of our life and times with Jacobo Romero.
Now, we talk about these sort of human currents that have occupied the space that you live in. I mean, you didn't get into it, but I guess the Clovis people that's somewhere in New Mexico, Clovis, New Mexico. I guess, as far as we know, they're sort of the first arrivals and maybe the ancestors of some of the native people. I'm not totally sure about that.
Actually, there's news on that front. A couple of years ago, results of an archaeological investigation in White Sands, in the Missile Range, down in southern, south central New Mexico. The results of this study were released, which show beyond a shadow of a doubt that human beings got to this part of the world, golly, almost 10,000 years earlier than Clovis people. It pushes the date of Homo sapiens in New Mexico back to 23,000 years before the present, and the information is quite clear. There were human footprints in a stratum of preserved sand that was datable, thanks to the presence of organic materials, mainly grass seeds, to 23,000 years ago.
Yeah, I read that.
It's very cool stuff.
And we don't know if those populations persisted to Clovis times, and those were the grandfathers of the tribal people that the Spanish met. Presumably so, but I mean, I don't know.
Probably the safest assumption is that whatever happened is more complicated than whatever we can imagine right now.
Yes.
The narratives that we invent about the past based on our scanty evidence are almost invariably wrong.
Yeah, and what is the deal with those ancient humans? They didn't do very well in terms of leaving a fossil record. We're leaving a lot of stuff for future millennia.
Because we produce a lot of junk.
Yes. Well, but with those people, everything was biodegradable. What were they thinking? Come on, it's ridiculous.
They lived a truly and completely sustainable life.
Yeah, well, all they left were those stupid friggin' arrow points. Help me out a little bit. I'm trying to figure this thing out. Dan, your friend Dan Flores, Wild New World Dan Flores, he makes the case that the Anthropocene really begins with the Clovis people. That one of his major theses is that this environment that is being completely manipulated by humanity really begins not with Los Alamos down the street, with atomic bombs and refrigerators and internal combustion engines. But it's actually he claims that it really begins way earlier. I don't have
Yeah,
an opinion.
and I think that can be a very strong argument, and if you make it in the context of geological time, it doesn't matter
No,
because it's just a blink of an eye.
right.
It's 23,000 years, or in case of Clovis, whatever that is, 16,000 or whatever. That sounds like a lot, but it's nothing.
It's nothing.
You
It's
were just in the Grand Canyon. You saw strata rising above you for thousands of feet, representing, golly, close to 1 billion years.
more 1.4 as far as a matter of fact, when you start at Lee's Ferry,
Yeah,
you're basically the ridges there are the most recent in times, and that's just Triassic. So like that's the beginning of the Triassic. So that's the dinosaurs are just getting going, man. They're just getting their sea legs going, and that's when it starts. So everything below that is you know let's see, Permian and below, all the way down to Cambrian, and then
yeah,
it was mind blowing. I loved all that. That was my
yeah.
favorite part.
I mean, I think there is no better place on the continent of North America than the Grand Canyon to experience, to really understand the significance of deep time.
Hmm.
In fact, uh, a friend of mine, a guy named Steve Hahn, historian now retired from Arizona State University, wrote a brilliant little book on how the canyon became grand.
Oh,
One of the points he makes, which is right on, is that without the concept of deep time, the Grand Canyon is merely baffling.
absolutely.
And without the concept of deep time, natural selection, the theories of Charles Darwin make absolutely no sense. Plate tectonics makes no sense. Deep time, discovering that, opened the door to really the pushing forward of the earth sciences from the early part of the 19th century to the present.
Well, that was one of the brilliant things you did in your book, Conjuroba, was you masterfully wove the the intertwining of these concepts and that intellectual history, starting, I guess, with the stratigraphy breakthroughs of Mr. Lyle in
In the hut,
the
yeah,
foundation of geology, and then Darwin's on the heels of that. I guess he publishes in 1859.
but he goes sailing on the Beagle with a copy of volume 1 of Lyell's work with him.
Yeah, and then of course, in the latter part of our century, within our own lifetime, another intellectual revolution, which might be the title of this podcast, Tectonic Shifts with William deBuys, is the tectonic intellectual
Yeah,
revolution.
right, tectonics. That that became sort of solidified and accepted when I was a young teenager.
Right. And it started, as you mentioned, quite clearly in your book, with the radar surveying of the ocean floors, as they're trying. We got to find out some hideouts for these submarines, because otherwise, we're going to get blasted. We find me some caves. And they go, well, there's this trench. It seems to be widening in the middle of the Pacific, and there's another one here in the Atlantic.
Once again, military funds and research stimulated a real breakthrough in science and,
yes, yeah, but I
and
love.
also in military strategy.
Right, but I love the way one moment I'm gasping for air at some Nepalese pass, going by a little Buddha shrine, and then the next chapter I'm into Lyle, and the last sentence of Darwin's book. I copied and pasted it because it's an affirmation, I think, of some of your most core beliefs about just
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the great sentences in human literature. It's a sentence that everybody should read, not once, but repeatedly. It's a beautiful piece of work that reflects some of the most beautiful thinking a human being has ever accomplished.
and the Darwinian intellectual revolution uh, really captured me because I've written 10 screenplays. I've directed a movie that I wrote, and I've been stuck for about 2 years because I fell into this hole called research that I've not been able to climb out of.
It's a bummer, isn't it?
It's terrible. But you got Cope and you got Marsh, in the 19th century, these competing scientists who basically are, we're talking about deep time, you
Yeah.
know, making these Eocene mammals in the Utah West, and then they stumble upon these Jurassic finds in a place called Como Bluff, which I have to say I went to Como Bluff and walked the bluff and was looking myself, and so I got completely consumed by this, the idea that these paleontologists from the East, from big institutions, were hiring out outlaws.
Now I'm beginning to understand all the model dinosaurs on the shelf behind you.
Oh yeah, here's some. Yeah, these things are fantastic. I was giving them to kids, but they're so brilliant and beautiful. I can't help it. And I did a dig. So here, look, I don't even know what this is, but that is a bone, minimum 67 million years, because
Wow.
that's the extinction event, right?
Yeah.
And I went on I got invited to go on he would give me fragments that they couldn't do anything. So I wasn't like,
You didn't violate the Federal Antiquities Act.
no, no. And these were he had private permission. He goes, take it. I can't do anything with this. I said, really? I said, okay. So I was I got stuck, okay, trying to figure out like outlaws who get repurposed to dig dinosaurs in the West, I don't know. It's just, I know you're working on a novel, so you're probably talk to me about that process. It's a little different than probably what you've been writing in the past.
Well, it is, and it isn't. The novel started. I came across an archive of a trial of a sea captain for the crime of losing his ship, and this archive was created. The record of the trial was created in 1764. So I began transcribing it. It was in French too. The hardest thing was just deciphering the writing from 1764 of a hurried port clerk trying to get everything down as witnesses presented their testimony. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that the backstory of the people involved, the witnesses, the prosecutor, the ship captain, etc., were really intriguing, and that the existence of this court record meant that there was a whole set of facts, a whole sort of plot that I didn't have to invent.
Oh,
So I was free to invent around the margins, but I had the trial moving things forward in ways often surprising that I could never have come up with in my imagination.
well, to me, when you're trying to figure out story, that's the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
That is where, I can throw out a lumbar, that is where it's really hard. So that sounds fascinating. Of course, sea stories are one of my favorite genres,
Wow.
whether it's Melville or there's just a whole. I wrote one myself, but it was a screenplay that was never made called The Purple
Uh,
Haze. Actually, I'll tell you about it because I was inspired by Edward Abbey.
oh, yeah.
And some years back in the marina here in Los Angeles, we had a boat and we'd go out and I saw this big black old rust bucket of a Coast Guard cutter from the 50s. And there were all these hippie types and kind of like, they were working on the boat. Anyway, I go, what is going on here? It's Paul Watkins. It's the guy from the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society.
Hmm.
Later became famous with whale wars on television. And I thought, wait a minute, this is a story. 19th century sea adventure right out of Marina del Rey with eco warriors. Bingo! You know, I went out to sea with them. I did the whole thing.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, wrote the script. Unlike books, screenplays are a request to be a movie.
Yeah, yeah.
They sit there and they don't become movies. They just fucking piss you off for the rest of your life. They don't generally have the same, like a book. You wrote a book, read it.
Yeah, yeah.
You wrote a screenplay. Well, I can't wait to see the movie.
Yeah.
This is like some built-in frustration, but I live in Hollywood, so it's it's
In the water there.
it's the way I was raised. Now, frankly, just talking about movies, and I'm more interested in you than me, but nobody goes to movies anymore. It's pretty depressing. The big cinemas that I used to go to regularly, they're boarded up since COVID. So it's kind of sad. I want to run a couple names by you
Sure.
because you wrote about them and it's integral. Why is John Wesley Powell important, other than being the first guy down the river or white guy down the river and writing about it?
Well, I got interested in Powell not just because he was a intrepid explorer, which he absolutely was, and he in his day he went into the largest blank spot on the map of what's now the continental United States.
Mm-hmm.
So sure, adventure right there. I'm with you. But as I got to know Powell, I began to appreciate that he had a comprehensive view for the settlement of the American West at a time before the patterns of settlement were set in stone. And I became very interested in what his recommendations were. He was, to use a very modern term, a bioregionalist. He thought that the West should be settled, in a sense, watershed by watershed, using the assets of each watershed and recognizing the limits of what each watershed could sustain. And we're very far from that in the way the history of the West actually proceeded. But Powell became, for me, a kind of touch point for the path not taken in the settlement of the American West.
Well, there was so much promotion and the railroads, and what was the expression? If you plow it, the rains will come. There was a term.
Rain will follow the plow.
The rain will follow the plow.
Other hallucinatory counterfactuals. Yeah.
But those
of the last election are not the only ones in American history.
Right. But those ideas really, I guess, prevailed over Powell's, at least in terms of.
Oh, they did. He ran smack into the real estate industry, basically, which was driving all the other industries. I think it was Ed Abbey who said the history of the American West is one big real estate deal.
Yes. Yeah. It's a great writer. I did a podcast with him. He wrote City of Quartz, and it's all about that in Southern California. Mike Davis. Yeah, I did a show with him right before he died. He was great. But, he was onto that. And Southern California is really about real estate hucksterism in the extreme.
You mentioned Chinatown a while ago. That's what Chinatown is about.
Right.
For my money, one of the 5 best American movies ever made.
Absolutely.
And I dug into that in my own book, Salt Dreams, which you read. Which,
of course.
Yeah. Here was this accidental large lake called the Salton Sea, and it unleashed yet another real estate frenzy, which was screamingly funny and ironic, and it became impossible to tell the hucksters from their victims. Everybody was mashed up in it together.
I was, like I said, I was canvassing. I think it was Los Leones, right below Yuma, where you wrote about extensively, and I was irritated because the Kamala bus to get there drove down the, the Pacific coast and then took a left turn through El Cajon across the desert to Yuma, and I go, damn it, I want to see the Salton Sea. This is the slow way. We're supposed to go through the friggin' Palm Springs and the Coachella Valley. What are you friggin' doing? I'm the one guy screaming this because I'm reading Salt Dreams, right?
Wow.
But fortunately, on the way back, we did go through. And I got, El Centro, all that agriculture. And of course, there was the Salton Sea.
Yeah.
And it looked, the wind was howling across it, and you got right into what a toxic brew it has become. But it's also the latest iteration of an ancient lake that you described, Lake Cahuila. I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is in a way not totally unnatural because it took some human intervention to create that again. And in all likelihood, in some days, it'll recede. And by the way, speaking of conservancy, it was just in the LA Times today that there is now an extra push to have more monument set-asides adjacent to Joshua Tree, continuing all the way down there, hoping that they can get Biden to sign off on some of this stuff, before he leaves in January, which,
Well, fingers crossed.
I know that's way back in your bibliography and it's not as close to your memory, but I really appreciated it because I feel like it's fundamental to my survival in the Southwest. That river is the big aorta that makes so much possible.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And for my money, parts of that desert are supremely beautiful. I think Anza Borrego State Park may be the most beautiful state park I've ever been in the United States. Some of the desert areas is just sublime, just perfectly lovely. Yeah.
One of the questions I have for you, and I actually posed it to Kevin Greif, is I took a shower this morning. I had salad for dinner. I perform in Vegas. There's a lot of lights that are powered by the hydroelectric turbines from the Hoover Dam. I, like so many millions of others, are beneficiary of this in the 20th century. And yet I also want to preserve and enjoy and experience the parts of the world and the world that I live in here that are still wild. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Oh, we are all trapped in that paradox. You can't get out of it. And so we all have to try to live consciously within it, reduce our footprint, behave responsibly, try to use resources modestly as possible. All those things. It's all about restraint. And unfortunately, the United States is not very good at restraint, and especially not now, as the last election tells us. We cannot go back and rewrite the history, but we can work at ameliorating the negative effects of our footprints right now, today. And that's the work ahead of us.
And we have to find a way, I think, to do it and not be depressed and still enjoy our lives because they're going by either way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tried to write about that in The Trail to Conjuroba, which is the third book in my accidental trilogy. I'm not sure if I mentioned that to you, but I did a book on climate change in the Southwest. I did another on a very rare animal in Southeast Asia.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, that book became a book about the war on wildlife. And the third book in this accidental trilogy, which is accidental because I never would have had the nerve to start out writing something that big, But the third book is really a book about when we know what we know about climate change and about the impact of human beings on wildlife and the rest of nature. What do we do? How do we, if you'll pardon me, keep our shit together? How do we proceed with living a life of integrity in full knowledge of how dire the situation is becoming for the natural world? And that's really the subject of the Trail to Conjuroba, the completion of that trilogy.
One of the things that I can say in my lifetime, trying to be hopeful, is that when I was a kid, I played baseball, played football in the San Fernando Valley, was enclosed by all these mountains. Very often in the 70s, practice canceled, smog alert, forget about it. You can't play. Well, and let's go to the beach. You can't go in the water. The sewage treatment was a blowout. Okay, there has been no smog alerts in 20 years. Air quality management district, human intervention, a higher consciousness, get the lead out. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's way better than when I was a kid.
Absolutely.
I'm a surfer, always out there paddling, my crew. I like to dive, paddle. Ocean's way better than it used to be too, because now they have a higher level of sewage treatment. You mentioned in your book that there's elk in those mountains that were reintroduced that weren't there.
Absolutely. We get a lot of things right. And this is the most tragic irony of our current situation is that technologically, I mean, it's not brain surgery. We know how to solve these problems. It's the will. The natural ecology is only half as complicated as the political ecology that has to be mastered in order to bring solutions to these problems. Technically, technologically, we can solve climate change, but we can't get our act together enough.
Well, you mentioned, I don't know where I read it or heard it, that, the political challenges and the political skills are, something that you've also refined with some of these land set-asides and President Clinton some years back. You've been right at the cutting edge of that and seen some wins. And so
the trouble is that in the environmental field, almost all the wins are temporary and all the losses are permanent. That's not always true, but it's mostly true.
Well, that's a tough pill to swallow. I've grappled that with myself, in terms of like, do I want to feel depressed and hopeless? I love to fly fish, and it's sort of a way that I can embrace some of my hunter-gatherer instincts without killing anything.
Yeah.
And I know you're actually in some pretty nice areas. I was at the San Juan River some years back. I think it's below Navajo Dam up there, but there's some just beautiful rivers and water. I hope it's still there.
And below Navajo Dam is one of the great trout fisheries of the West.
Yes.
That cold water comes out of the dam. It's terrific fishing. That you're touching on the most fundamental challenge of our time, and that is to remain human, to remain hopeful, to remain positive, even in a continuing storm of bad news. And again, that's part of what I tried to write about in Trail to Conjuroba. There is a section in that book, I think it's divided into 61 episodes. They're too short to be called chapters.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the episodes is titled Hope.
Right.
And when I give talks now, I finish by reading that section on hope, because hope is a very complicated thing. Different people have different versions of it. A lot of people think, oh, hope is just this wish that everything will turn out fine. No, that's not really hope. Hope is more subtle than that. And the book goes into that. And if we have a a truly deep and sort of well evolved spirit of hope within us that can sustain us through any kind of hard times, because it so depends on a faith in surprise. We cannot predict the future with exactitude. Stuff happens that we can't explain beforehand. A COVID epidemic, the fall of the Soviet Union. No one saw that coming.
No.
Happened that completely changed the landscape around us. And if we're hopeful, we stay ready to make the most of those fundamental changes and to move toward a brighter time.
Well, I'm going to try and hold on to those words. I couldn't help but think about that asteroid 67 million years ago that splashed into Yucatan. That was the worst day on Earth if you were there. But if you were a mammal,
it was a great day for mammals.
It was the best day we've ever had. As a matter of fact, right. Instead of Columbus Day, we should be celebrating Asteroid Day.
Without that son of a gun, you and I wouldn't be here now.
No, this podcast doesn't get its start. There's no movies. Polanski doesn't make Chinatown. Robert Towne doesn't. And there's so much happens as a result of that unanticipated event. I don't wish that for us, but anything's possible.
Yeah.
William, can I call you Bill?
Sure.
deBuys, what a pleasure. I feel so honored, to have had this conversation with you, especially after having written your books. And now I'm like, oh my God, there's a new sea story coming down the pike. Captain Queeg meets La Perouse. There's a bay in Maui called La Perouse Bay where the French ship Astrolabe, I don't know how you say it, had moored there. You don't read a lot about French exploration, but I guess it was there as well. So
there was plenty of it, and I got drawn into this because the captain who was put on trial was my great grandfather.
Oh, was he convicted?
The record is a little cloudy on that, and he did make it back from the Caribbean to his home port of Dunkirk in the northeast of France. So he did not perish. He was not executed, and he did not perish in prison.
So when he lost the ship, did it mean he misplaced it? I put it here; it was gone, or he sunk it.
It ran aground in a storm.
It ran aground,
broken up by the seas after that.
Well, there's a great book about the discovery of longitude and So they had latitude. They couldn't quite figure out that longitude.
Oh, he didn't even have latitude because the sky was obscured for a solid week while things just went from bad to worse.
Oh, yeah.
So he didn't know where the heck he was.
Oh, wow. Well, at least you're looking after your ancestors. That's a good thing. I can't wait to read the book, and I think I've got some more reading I want to do, and I got to get out to New Mexico, and I hope I get a chance to meet you in person. And I really appreciate this conversation, and I do feel better about our current moment. And I'm trying to look at it as a grain of sand in the geological continuum so that I don't go nuts. And
I think Dr. King was quite right when he said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
Right. And sometimes that arc is so subtle, you can't quite see it.
Yeah. But if you think about how the races got along when you were a boy, about how people of non-traditional gender preferences were treated in those times, there are so many areas in which things are better now than they were, even if they're still really screwed up. And we just got to keep pushing.
Absolutely. I'm going to hold that as the final thought, because I think, maybe we place too much of a premium on the student body presidents and some of the vicissitudes of, high school politics here in America. So Bill, I want to thank you for this deep dive. Folks, a very powerful recommendation for the Trails to Conjiroba, Rediscovering Earth in an Age of Loss. And it's not only a great adventure, but it's a philosophical journey. Salt Dreams, which I really loved. And if you're interested in the water and the way things work, you couldn't do better than to read Salt Dreams. And the last one I read is Enchantment and Exploitation: The Life and Hard Times of a New Mexican Mountain Range, all of which have implications not only in New Mexico, but all over the world. Thank you, folks. Until next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namasaloha. See ya.